It was the ultimate seat of power in Hollywood, the mahogany desk of Johnny Carson. For a comedian, an invite to The Tonight Show wasn't just a gig, it was a coronation. Rodney Dangerfield, the man who got no respect, finally had the world's respect. Johnny loved him. The audience adored him. But in one single moment, a joke was told that went too far. It didn't just cross the line, it erased it. The laughter stopped, the air in the studio turned cold, and the most famous friendship in comedy vanished overnight. We often see the punchline, but we rarely see the price paid behind the curtain. What could be so offensive that it would make the king of late night turn his back on a legend forever? Rodney Dangerfield wasn't always the icon in the black suit and red tie. Long before he was a household name, he was Jacob Cohen, a man who felt like a ghost in his own life. For years, he wandered the periphery of the entertainment world, failing so spectacularly at comedy that he eventually gave up entirely. He spent over a decade selling aluminum siding, a job that required a thick skin and a desperate kind of charm. But even as he knocked on doors, the itch for the stage remained. This period of his life was more than just a career lull, it was a psychological foundation. He felt ignored by the world, a feeling that would eventually crystallize into his famous, no respect, persona. This wasn't just a clever catchphrase, it was a confession of a man who felt fundamentally undervalued. When Rodney finally decided to return to comedy in his 40s, he didn't come back as a confident star. He came back as a nervous wreck. This vulnerability was his secret weapon. When he finally landed a spot on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, the chemistry was instant. Johnny, who was notoriously picky about guests, found Rodney's twitchy, sweat-soaked delivery refreshing. In a world of polished celebrities, Rodney was a mess, and Johnny loved it. For Rodney, Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host, he was the ultimate validator. Every time Johnny laughed, a piece of Jacob Cohen's old insecurity was healed. For nearly 10 years, Rodney was a staple on the show. He became one of the few performers who could make the king of late night genuinely lose control. To the public, they were the perfect comedic duo. But beneath the surface, Rodney's psychological makeup was fragile. He didn't just want the laughs, he needed them to survive. This need for constant, escalating approval created a dangerous feedback loop. Rodney began to believe that the only way to keep Johnny's interest was to push the envelope further and further. He was addicted to the roar of the crowd, and that addiction started to blur his judgment. He began to feel invincible, protected by the golden shield of Johnny's friendship. He felt that as long as Johnny was laughing, he was safe. But as Rodney's fame reached its peak, he began to resent the very boundaries that had made him a star, leading him to ignore a very specific warning Johnny had given him about the show's invisible limits. The set of The Tonight Show was more than a television studio, it was a psychological battlefield with very strict, unspoken rules. Johnny Carson ran his kingdom with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove. He curated an atmosphere that felt like a sophisticated cocktail party. Guests were expected to be witty, charming, and above all, respectful of the medium. Johnny had a profound respect for the living room audience. He believed that when he entered someone's home via the television screen, he was a guest, and guests did not behave crudely. While the 1970s and 80s were bringing a wave of blue comedy to clubs, Johnny kept his stage relatively clean. Rodney Dangerfield, however, was spending his nights in those very clubs. In the dark, smoke-filled rooms of Las Vegas and New York, Rodney was seeing a different side of comedy. He saw that the biggest laughs often came from the most shocking places. Psychologically, Rodney began to feel a disconnect between his TV persona and his real, comedic self. He felt that the no respect character was becoming a cage. He wanted to show Johnny, and the world, that he could handle the heavy stuff. He mistakenly interpreted Johnny's personal fondness for him as a license to break the rules of the show. This was a classic case of psychological projection. Because Rodney felt so close to Johnny, he assumed Johnny shared his desire to tear down the walls of polite society. He didn't realize that Johnny's public image was his most prized possession. To Johnny, the show was a sacred trust. You could talk about your failing marriage or your bad health, classic Rodney tropes, but you could not be vulgar. Rodney started to chafe under these restrictions. He felt like he was being treated like a child rather than an equal. He began to prepare a set that would prove he was the edgiest man in the room. He wanted to shock Johnny into a new level of respect, failing to see that shock is often the enemy of intimacy. On a fateful Tuesday night in the early 1980s, Rodney decided to toss out his approved script and replace it with a joke so graphic that his own writers had begged him not to tell it. The energy in the studio that night was electric. Rodney walked out to the familiar brassy theme music, adjusting his tie with that signature nervous energy. The first few minutes were vintage Dangerfield. He complained about his doctor, his wife, and his dog. The audience was in the palm of his hand. Johnny was leaning back, the familiar grin on his face. But then, Rodney took a deep breath. He pivoted away from the self-deprecating humor and toward a story that felt different. It was a joke involving a graphic medical procedure and a highly inappropriate comment about a family member's body. The moment the punchline hit, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It wasn't just that the joke wasn't funny to the TV audience, it was that it felt invasive. In the world of fifth-grade level understanding, it was like someone saying something gross at a fancy dinner party. The laughter didn't roar, it curdled. You could hear a few scattered, nervous chuckles from the back of the room, but the front rows, the ones Johnny watched, were silent. Rodney, fueled by his own adrenaline and the psychological need to win the room back, didn't stop. He leaned into the silence, making the joke even more descriptive. The camera stayed on Rodney, but the real story was happening just off-center at the desk. Johnny Carson's face underwent a visible transformation. The warmth drained out of his eyes, replaced by a cold, professional mask. For Johnny, this wasn't just a bad joke, it was a betrayal of the living room trust. He felt that Rodney had made the show, and by extension, Johnny, look cheap. Rodney looked toward the desk, hoping for a save, a laugh, or even a playful scolding. He got none of it. Johnny didn't even look up from his notes. He waited for Rodney to finish, then simply moved on to the next segment with a mechanical efficiency that was terrifying. The friendship hadn't just cracked, it had shattered in front of millions of people. As the show went to commercial, Rodney reached out to pat Johnny's arm, but Johnny pulled away so sharply that the entire crew froze, signaling the start of a banishment that would last for years. The silence in the studio during the commercial break was louder than any applause. In the industry, they call it the big chill. Johnny Carson was a master of the psychological freeze-out. When he was done with someone, they effectively ceased to exist in his universe. Rodney Dangerfield walked off that stage expecting a lecture, perhaps even a shouting match. Instead, he found a vacuum. No one spoke to him. The stagehands, who usually traded quips with him, suddenly found themselves very busy with cables and props. Johnny stayed behind his desk, staring straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge Rodney's presence as he walked past to the exit. For a man like Rodney, who built his entire identity on the need for validation, this was the ultimate punishment. Psychologically, being ignored is often more damaging than being attacked. It confirmed his deepest fear, that he was, in fact, worth nothing. He went back to his hotel room and waited for the phone to ring. He expected a call from a producer, or perhaps a stern warning from NBC executives. But the phone stayed silent. It wasn't until the next day, when his agent tried to book a follow-up appearance, that the word came down, Rodney was out. No explanation was given, and none was needed. The disgusting joke had become a wall between two of the most powerful men in comedy. The banishment had an immediate effect on Rodney's mental health. He became obsessed with the silence. He would replay the tape of the show over and over, trying to find the exact millisecond where he lost Johnny. He began to realize that he hadn't just lost a gig, he had lost his father figure. Johnny had been the one who told the world that Rodney was okay, and now that same man was telling the world he was garbage. This period of exile was a dark time for Rodney. He began to retreat into himself, his "no respect" act becoming a bitter reality. He felt like the aluminum siding salesman again, a man on the outside looking in, wondering why the door had been slammed in his face. As Rodney's professional life began to suffer from the lack of the Carson bump, he realized that he wasn't just fighting for his career, he was fighting to prove he wasn't the loser he joked about being. In the 1980s, the Carson bump was the lifeblood of a comedian's career. Without it, the momentum slowed. While Rodney was still a legend, the lack of Tonight Show appearances meant he was no longer at the center of the cultural conversation. He was relegated to the old guard. Psychologically, this was a crushing blow. Rodney began to see the world through a lens of paranoia. He wondered if other hosts were avoiding him because of Johnny's disapproval. He felt the weight of the industry's judgment, and it fed into his existing depression. He had spent his life telling people he got no respect, but having it actually come true was a different kind of pain. The disgusting joke became a symbol of Rodney's internal struggle. He was a man caught between two worlds, the high society world of Johnny Carson and the gritty, honest world of the comedy clubs. By trying to bring the club to the palace, he had lost both. During these years of exile, Rodney's behavior became more erratic. He was known to pull people aside in Vegas and ask, "Does Johnny hate me? Did you hear anything?" This desperation was a far cry from the confident star he had once been. He was looking for a way back into the light, but the gatekeeper was unmoved. There is a psychological concept called shame rage, where a person feels so much shame they become angry at the person who caused it. Rodney went through phases of being angry at Johnny, calling him uptight or out of touch. But deep down, the anger was always directed at himself. He knew he had crossed a line that didn't need to be crossed. He had risked a priceless friendship for a cheap laugh that didn't even land. This realization led to a period of deep self-reflection. He had to decide if he was going to let this band define the rest of his life or if he was going to find a way to grow beyond the need for Johnny's approval. Just as Rodney was beginning to accept his life in the shadows of the mainstream, a sudden change in Johnny's own life, a personal tragedy, began to crack the ice of their long-standing feud. By the early 1990s, the world was a very different place. Comedy had become louder, faster, and much cruder. The joke that had gotten Rodney banned now seemed almost quaint compared to the material being performed on HBO specials. Johnny Carson himself was preparing for retirement. As he began to look back on his 30-year career, the faces of the people he had helped started to matter more than the mistakes they had made. Johnny had experienced his own share of personal loss and isolation, and it seemed to soften his legendary ice. He realized that life was too short to hold a grudge over a few minutes of bad television. The reconciliation didn't happen with a fanfare. It started with a simple gesture. A mutual friend, a comedian who worked with both men, mentioned to Johnny that Rodney was struggling and that he missed his friend. Instead of the usual silence, Johnny reportedly sighed and said, "Rodney was always his own worst enemy." This was the first sign that the door was ajar. Psychologically, both men were in a place of late-life review. They were no longer the young guns fighting for territory, they were elders of the tribe. Rodney's health was failing, and Johnny's era was ending. The ego that had caused the rift was finally being replaced by a sense of shared history. When the invitation finally came for Rodney to return, it wasn't just a booking, it was an olive branch. Rodney's reaction was one of pure, childlike relief. The weight that had been on his shoulders for years finally lifted. He didn't need to apologize for the joke, and Johnny didn't need to explain the ban. They both understood that the no respect guy and the king of late night were human beings who had simply lost their way. This road to forgiveness shows us that even the deepest psychological wounds can heal with time and perspective. Rodney wasn't just getting back on a TV show, he was getting his dignity back. The night of the return was set, but one question remained: would Rodney be able to handle the pressure of the desk, or would the ghost of the disgusting joke cause him to stumble one last time? The night of Rodney's return to The Tonight Show felt like a historic event. The studio audience knew the history, they knew this was a reunion years in the making. When Rodney walked out, he didn't look like the twitchy, desperate man of a decade ago. He looked like a man who had made peace with himself. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Even the band seemed to play a little louder. Rodney didn't launch into his set immediately. He stood there, soaking in the respect he had claimed he never had. The set was a masterclass. He was sharp, he was funny, and he stayed perfectly within the lines. He proved that he didn't need the shock value to be the funniest man in the room. He leaned into the very themes that had made him a star, the struggles of being a man who just can't win. But this time, it felt like a shared joke between him and the audience, rather than a cry for help. When he finally walked over to the desk to sit with Johnny, the world held its breath. The two men looked at each other, and for a second, the years of silence vanished. Johnny greeted him with a genuine smile. "It's good to have you back, Rodney," he said. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of a decade of forgiveness. They talked about the old days, and Rodney even made a small, self-deprecating joke about taking a little vacation from the show. The audience laughed, Johnny laughed, and the tension that had defined their relationship for so long was finally released. This wasn't just a segment of television, it was a psychological resolution. Rodney had finally found the respect he was looking for, not by being the edgiest comedian, but by being the most resilient one. He had survived the ban, survived the silence, and come back stronger. As the credits rolled and the two legends shook hands, Rodney whispered something to Johnny that made the king burst into his famous, desk-slapping laugh, leaving fans to wonder what that final, secret joke could have been. Rodney Dangerfield passed away in 2004, but his story continues to resonate because it is a deeply human one. The saga of the disgusting joke isn't just a piece of trivia, it's a lesson in the psychological dynamics of fame and friendship. Rodney spent his life telling us that he got no respect, and in a strange way, the ban from Johnny Carson was the ultimate validation of that persona. It turned his comedy into a lived experience. It showed his audience that he wasn't just a character, he was a man who actually suffered the consequences of being himself. His legacy is one of transformation. He taught us that our greatest flaws, the things that get us banned or pushed to the margins, can also be our greatest sources of strength. Rodney's willingness to be the loser, to be the man who makes the wrong joke at the wrong time, made him relatable to millions. He represented every person who has ever felt overlooked or misunderstood. Psychologically, his return to Carson's stage was a victory for the underdog. It proved that mistakes don't have to be permanent and that even the most powerful gatekeepers can be reached with enough persistence and heart. When we look back at the footage of Rodney and Johnny, we see more than just two comedians. We see the evolution of a relationship. We see how pride can tear people apart and how empathy can bring them back together. Rodney Dangerfield didn't just leave us with punchlines, he left us with a story about the human need to be seen and accepted for who we are, warts and all. He proved that even if you start out as an aluminum siding salesman who can't get a break, you can end up as a legend whose name is synonymous with comedy itself. Rodney's journey reminds us that the perfect punchline isn't nearly as important as the people we share it with. If you were in his shoes, would you have valued the laugh more than the friend? Perhaps the greatest joke Rodney ever told was the one where he finally got the respect he deserved, by simply being himself. What is one area in your own life where you felt like you got no respect, and how can Rodney's story help you find your own way back to the desk?